Hey, fifth grade. This week we are going to be really practicing finding a main idea of a text, and we have found the perfect book to help us practice to do that. The book is called The Dreadful Smelly Colonies: The Disgusting Details About Life in Colonial America. So, this book is by Elizabeth Rom, and she wrote it to teach others what it was truly like for the colonists that came to America. A lot of times when I think of the colonies, I think of the first Thanksgiving and I think of them starting our country. But a lot of times we forget or we don't know about the disgusting details that they actually had to go through to start our country. So I'm excited to dive into this book. Before we do, let's talk a little bit about what the main idea is before we practice finding it. Remember, when I find the topic of a book, that's just who the story is about or what the story is about. Normally, it's just one or two words. The main idea, however, is the most important part of that topic. So I always like to tell students, as you are searching for a main idea, always be asking yourself, what is the author trying to teach me about the topic? Okay, so keep that in mind as I'm reading a section of this book today. There are so many different strategies to find the main idea of a text. Some of these we have talked about before, so let's just kind of review. You can always reread the first or the last sentence of a paragraph. You can check for repeating words or repeating phrases and ideas. This next one I'm going to be focusing on today, where you chunk each paragraph and then you get to put it together at the end. So I'm really going to be focusing on each paragraph in my section. And then the last one says you can always study the text features. So looking at the captions, the pictures, the bold words, that can all really help you find the main idea as well. So let's start to read this book and let's get started. Okay, as I read this story, I'm going to make sure to use my highlighter tool to be highlighting details that I noticed throughout the text. After each paragraph, I am going to pause and I'm just going to check my thinking and I'm going to ask myself, what was that paragraph about? Let's get started. This section is called New Land, New Home. In the 1600s, colonists came to America from Europe with the hopes of freedom and a new beginning. What they found instead was rough land, harsh weather, and dreadful living conditions. When the colonists arrived in America, no warm, cozy homes were waiting for them, so they needed to find shelter fast. Okay, right away after this section, I'm noticing that when they came to America, nothing was there. They had to build everything from scratch. I am also noticing that they had high hopes of a fresh start and a new beginning, but what they actually found was different from what they were hoping. So I'm going to highlight right here. It says they found rough land, harsh weather, and dreadful living conditions. So that might have been just a kind of bit of a letdown from their high hopes that they had. Okay, let's keep going. In the southern colonies, the first colonists lived in tents made of sailcloth. They complained bitterly of the bugs. Mosquitoes feasted on the new arrivals. Okay, so in this paragraph, I'm learning that the southern colonies, they had tents that were made of sailcloth. So I'm going to highlight that right there because that's a certain type of shelter that I know it'll be important for me to know. I'm also going to highlight this section about the bugs and mosquitoes. That's not very fun to be living with bugs and mosquitoes. Let's keep going right here. Other colonists built small wigwams. They tied poles together and covered them with bark and tree branches to keep out the winter's cold. A fire added light, heat, and blinding smoke. In winter, families huddled on the straw floor beneath furs and blankets. Okay, so this paragraph is teaching me all about how some colonists had wigwams to live in. So I'm going to highlight that right there. So a detail I'm noticing that they taught me, or the author taught me about wigwams, was that there was a lot of blinding smoke. in those shelters as they were living because they needed it for the heat and the light. Okay, so far I'm noticing a lot of details of some dreadful shelters that the colonists had to build. Let's keep going. Some settlers in Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania dug cave-like homes. Ooh, okay, I'm going to stop and highlight that right there. That's a new type of shelter. They lined dirt walls with sticks to prevent the home from collapsing. One wall contained a small door. Bugs skittered in through the tree branch roof and dropped onto sleepers. Ooh. Mice, rats, and snakes slithered through the sod. Oh, okay. So I was hoping these cave-like homes would be better for the colonists, but I'm going to highlight right here that in these types of shelters, since it was built into the ground and it was built into the dirt, that mice, rats, and snakes could just pop right in because they would be slithering through that sod. Okay, the first wooden houses were only about 20 feet or 6 meters wide by 20 feet or 6 meters long. Shutters over the window kept out the wind, but they also kept out the light. A fire burned constantly to provide light and heat. Everyone ate, worked, and slept in just one room. A lucky family might have had a table or two chairs. Children stood while they ate their meals. They slept on the floor on mattresses stuffed with rags, corn husks, or bits of leftover wool. Houses smelled of smoke, stew, and sweaty bodies. Ugh. So this paragraph is teaching me about how eventually they did have some wooden houses. Some details I'm noticing about this one is they weren't very big. It was just one room where everyone slept, worked, and ate in. And because of that, the house always smelled like smoke, stew, and sweaty bodies, which is not very great to live in. All right, so I'm looking at the text I just read. I'm looking at all of my highlighted details throughout each paragraph. As I was reading, I paused and I asked myself, what was this paragraph mostly about? The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to review my details. I'm going to put it all together to find the main idea of that section I just read. Remember, the main idea is what the text is mostly about. It's the most important part of the topic. And then after I find my main idea, I'm going to list some details that help support my main idea. Remember, my details are facts and examples that help prove that my main idea is true. So I'm just going to go back and I'm going to review quickly. Remember, I learned in each paragraph, my first paragraph, I learned that it was pretty harsh, it was dreadful, it was rough land. And then each paragraph in this section talked about a different type of shelter, but then it also gave me an example of how that shelter was pretty dreadful. So remember, I learned about the tents made of sailcloth. Those let in a bunch of mosquitoes. I learned about wigwams, but those were filled with blinding smoke. I learned about cave-like homes that let in mice, rats, and snakes. And then I also learned about the first wooden houses, which were pretty small. They had one room, and so they always smelled like smoke, stew, and sweaty bodies. Okay, so now I'm going to take all of that information and I'm going to put it together to make my main idea for that section. For me, I'm thinking that the main idea is that colonists, let me make this a little bigger. I think the main idea is colonists lived in many different types of shelters to survive. Remember, each paragraph focused on a different type of shelter, but that wasn't it. I think the author really wanted me to learn that all of those shelters were pretty dreadful. Okay, so I have colonists lived in many different shelters to survive, but all were pretty dreadful. I think that's a solid main idea. Now on to my details. Remember, my details are facts and examples from the text, and I use those to prove that they lived in different types and they were all dreadful. So I'm remembering some things I learned from that text. One example is the tents. So the tents made of sailcloth allowed mosquitoes to feast on the colonists. That proves that it was pretty dreadful, right? And it's a certain type. Okay, my next example I remember was the wigwams. So I'm going to say, in wigwams, the fires added blinding smoke to their homes. Okay, and I'm not quite remembering another example. I'm going to quickly go back and I'm just going to look at what I have highlighted. Oh, yeah, the next paragraph talks about the cave-like homes. Those let in mice, rats, and snakes. So I'm going to add that. Cave-like homes were dug into the ground and allowed mice, rats, and snakes to slither into the homes. Ugh, okay, I have my main idea. Remember, this is what the author's trying to teach me about the text. I learned that they lived in different types of shelters, but all of them were pretty dreadful. And then I have my 3 details. I have 3 different examples of 3 different types of shelters, and I also explain how each of those were dreadful. Today, you are going to head to your nonfiction reading notebook for the week. You're going to head to slide 3, and then it's your turn to practice finding the main idea in details. So this is the next page in that book that we read for today's lesson. And this section is called No Privacy in the Privy. So you get to learn about how different the bathrooms were back then from what we use now. There are highlighter tools here for you to use. You can just drag over to find your details as you're reading. And then you're going to head to the next slide. And just like I did today, you're going to write down your main idea and your 3 supporting details.